which just celebrated That was Bob Marley. As we turn now to the 25th anniversary of FAIR, the Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the Media Watch Group in New York, which just celebrated the 25 years of the reports they've come out documenting media bias and censorship and scrutinized media practices that marginalize public interest, minority, and dissenting viewpoints. One of those who addressed the hundreds of people who gathered to celebrate FAIR was the world-renowned political dissident and linguist Noam Chomsky. This is some of what he had to say.
The U.S. and its allies will do anything they can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. The reason is very simple. Across the region, an overwhelming majority of the population regards the United States as the main threat to their interests. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so high that a considerable majority think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, the most important country, that's 80%. Similar figures elsewhere. There are some in the region who regard Iran as a threat, about 10%. Well, plainly the U.S. and its allies are not going to want governments which are responsive to the will of the people. If that happens, not only will the U.S. not control the region, but it'll be thrown out. So that's obviously an intolerable result. In the case of WikiLeaks, there was an interesting aside on this. The revelations from WikiLeaks that got the most publicity, headlines, euphoric commentary, and so on, were that the Arabs support U.S. policy on Iran. They were quoting comments of Arab dictators. Yes, they claimed to support U.S. policy on Iran. There was no mention of the Arab population, because it doesn't matter. If the dictators support us and the population's under control, then what's the problem? It's like imperialism. What's the problem if it works? As long as they can control their populations, fine. They can have campaigns of hatred. Our friendly dictators will keep them under control. That's the reaction, not just of the diplomatic service and the State Department, or of the media who reported this, but also of the general intellectual community. There's no comment on this. In fact, coverage of these polls is precisely zero in the United States, literally. There's a few comments in England, but very little. It just doesn't matter what the population thinks as long as they're under control. Well, from these observations, you can conclude pretty quickly, pretty easily, what policies are going to be. You can almost spell them out. So in the case of an oil-rich country with a reliable, obedient dictator, they're given free rein. Saudi Arabia is the most important. There were protests. That's the most repressive, extremist, strongest center of Islamic fundamentalism, missionaries who spread ultra-radical Islamism, fund jihadis, and so on. But they're obedient. They're reliable, so they can do what they like. There was a planned protest in Saudi Arabia. The police presence was so overwhelming and intimidating that literally nobody even was willing to show up in the streets of Riyadh. But that was fine. The same in Kuwait. There was a small demonstration, very quickly crushed, no comment. Actually, the most interesting case in many respects is Bahrain. Bahrain is quite important for two reasons. One reason, which has been reported, is that it's the home port of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, a major military force in the region. Another more fundamental reason is that Bahrain is about 70% Shiite, and it's right across the causeway from eastern Saudi Arabia, which also is majority Shiite, and happens to be where most of Saudi oil is. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the main energy resource, has been since the 40s. By a curious accident of history and geography, the world's major energy resources are located pretty much in Shiite regions. They're a minority in the Middle East, but they happen to be where the oil is, right around the northern part of the Gulf. That's eastern Saudi Arabia, southern Iraq, and southwestern Iran. And there's been a concern among planners for a long time that there might be a move towards some sort of tacit alliance in these Shiite regions, moving towards independence and controlling the bulk of the world's oil. That's obviously intolerable. So going back to Bahrain, there was an uprising, tent city in the central square, like Tahrir Square. The Saudi-led military forces invaded Bahrain, giving the security forces there the opportunity to crush it violently, destroyed the tent city, even destroyed the pearl, which is the symbol of Bahrain, invaded the major hospital complex, threw out the patients and the doctors, been regularly every day arresting human rights activists, torturing them, occasionally a sort of a pat on the wrist, but nothing much. That's very much the Carruthers principle. If actions correspond to our strategic and economic objectives, that's okay. We can have elegant rhetoric, but what matters is facts. Well, that's the oil-rich, obedient dictators. What about Egypt, most important country, but not a major center of oil production? Well, in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries of that category, there is a game plan which is employed routinely, so commonly it takes virtual genius not to perceive it. But when you have a favored dictator, for those of you who might think of going into the diplomatic service, you might as well learn it. When there's a favored dictator and he's getting into trouble, support him as long as possible, full support as long as possible. And when it becomes impossible to support him, like, say, maybe the army turns against him, business class turns against him, then